Let's talk about render setup in V-Ray. I decided to make a dedicated video on how to set up high quality render in V-Ray that doesn't take too long to calculate. But first, I recommend that you revisit a video on noise reduction in Corona first. Why? Well, because V-Ray and Corona are very similar in terms of the general setup, lighting setup, brightness of self-illumination materials, and many other things. So setting up correct lighting is crucial to getting rid of noise. That's been established. Noise is mostly generated by self-illumination materials. Extremely bright sun, extremely bright light sources that sit too close to geometry, things like that. So make sure to revisit that Corona video to learn how to set up a noise-free render in no time. All right, and now let's go back to V-Ray. So here on the left, I have the History tab with test renders that I've already done. And this time we won't have to spend time running test renders during this video. Here, all settings have been reset to default. If you use default settings for your render, you'll end up with a pretty solid result. This scene, for example, was rendered with default settings. The only thing I did is I assigned clay material as the override material, and I also excluded background from override, and that's it. Back in the day, it was commonly believed that there were some special V-Ray settings that delivered a beautiful result. Well, in reality, the key to a high-quality render is lighting setup. Render settings only affect noise, spots, and render speed, and that's it. They don't affect anything else. So you either get a noisy render fast or a clear render but slow. There's no third option here, all right? However, there is such thing as optimal settings. You can't take that away. But you can say that default settings are close to optimal, more or less. So in order to achieve a correct, good-looking render, you just need to fine-tune default settings. Just a tiny bit. Okay? Right, so let's get started. And first, let's examine each setting one by one. If I skip this or that setting, then it's not that important. If you want to learn more, browse through the FAQ section on the official website. So, I will only focus on settings that affect the final result. And by the way, if you're doing a preview render, you can disable displacement option here in the Common tab. Okay, now let's go to the V-Ray tab, and here we have the frame buffer settings. And so, what should we focus on first of all? Well, we can turn on an option called V-Ray Raw Image. And it's a special render format. It's very similar to the CXR format in Corona. And also you can check separate render channels to save all render elements to separate files. If you're saving your render as an external file, all render elements will be saved as individual files, which is very handy. Sometimes. We don't use this option very often. All right, what else? So next we have resumable rendering, and this thing allows us to stop and then resume the render. Just like in Corona. You can save your render to the V-Ray image format. So you turn on resumable rendering, then V-Ray raw image file, and then select autosave interval. This setting can come in handy if you have power outages, for example, or if your render keeps crashing because your computer performance is too low. All right, what's next? As you can see, there's a button called Default. So we click it to open Advanced Global Switch Settings. Here's an option called Displacement. And what displacement does is it enables or disables V-Ray's own displacement mapping. So basically, if you're rendering a preview, you can disable displacement option. You don't need it. Okay? Then we also have lights and shadows. And if you don't need light sources or shadows in your scene, you can turn them off. Just like that. But for now, we'll leave them on, because we usually render images as they are. If for some reason you want to turn off shadows or light, then go ahead and disable these options. But be careful with all these settings, because if you accidentally remove a check or switch to a different mode, you'll spend forever trying to figure out what's wrong with your render. Okay? Next we have hidden lights. It's for group light sources that are hidden. Corona has identical setting. So let's move on. We'll skip these settings. They work perfectly fine in the default mode. Then there's don't render final image. You may need this option when saving global illumination, irradiance map, for example, to a separate file. And it's mostly used for animation, so we'll skip it. If you have this option checked, V-Ray will only render global illumination. It won't be affected in the final render. Next we have reflection and refraction. It's for glass objects. We'll leave it as it is. Then we have maps. If you keep this option turned on, V-Ray will only render textures. As you can see, practically every element has its own option, and we can decide whether to enable or disable each of them separately. Then we have filter maps and filter for GI. They cause a slight texture blurriness, so it's best to turn them off to keep your texture sharp and clear. But if you stretch the texture too much, you bump into a risk of ending up with various artifacts. So it happens when you stretch a low resolution image. Next setting is glossy. Glossy has to do with blurry reflections. Practically any material has these. If you want your image to render fast, go ahead and disable this option. This way you'll avoid blurry reflections and refractions. So we'll leave it as it is. Then we have max transparency levels. It shows the number of re-reflections from objects. So suppose you have plenty of glassware in your scene, and it generates countless reflections. Well, you can lower this value to 20, let's say, and that will speed up your render. This way we get an adequate number of reflections, and this won't cause any artifacts. Then we have override depth. It's the number of refractions and reflections, and if we put two mirrors opposite each other, what they'll do is they'll reflect each other. And this parameter shows how many reflections we'll get. It shows the depth of that mirror corridor. So let's make it 5. It's a good value for a regular interior that doesn't have too many glass lamps or other glass objects. It's another way to slightly reduce render time. Alright, these settings we can skip. This is the override parameter. You already know about it. Next we have max ray. We'll skip it too. As for the rest of the settings, there is no need to change them. They work just fine with default values. Moving on, and here we have image sampler section. Let's tweak these settings a little bit. So there are 2 rendering methods. One is progressive. It's when you're rendering a noisy image and the noise is slowly going away. It's just like in Corona. Actually, V-Ray has become very similar to Corona in terms of settings and rendering processes. It also has adopted this progressive mode. But if you prefer the old school method with squares or buckets running all over your render, then go ahead and use the bucket mode. So let's take a closer look at each of these modes. And we'll start with progressive. Alright, so here we have the min subdivs parameter. It shows how many parts each light pixel is split into. The minimum value is 1, and the maximum value is 100. Now, during rendering, V-Ray decides on the number of light subdivisions per single pixel in each area of your image. And you can change the minimum number of subdivisions to 2 and the maximum number to 24. And the higher the value, the noisier image you'll get in the end. The number of subdivisions will stay within the specified range, however. Okay, now next we have noise threshold. And what noise threshold is it is a noise sensitivity. The default value is 0.01. I'll show you how these settings affect the render later in the video. But next we have array bundle size, and we're not going to change that. Then we have min shading rate. It shows the quality of your shadows. Render mask is a very useful setting for when you need to render a specific object or texture without rendering the rest of the scene. And you can select a texture, select an object, include, exclude list, layer, or object ID, and V-Ray will render it. This setting is mostly used for post-correction. So suppose we need to change a color of a plant, for example. And we select the plant and pick the selected category. And now V-Ray will only render that plant. And it's great for doing mirror corrections. Now let's see about these settings. This image here was rendered with default settings. And we'll zoom in to be able to see the noise. So render time was 15 minutes and 9 seconds. And again, this image was not optimized beyond its default settings. The next render. Look at the amount of noise. Here, the minimum number of subdivisions is 1, and the maximum number is 8. This is the level of noise that we've got here. So let's compare it with the previous render. The render time has reduced significantly. For the second render, it's 2 minutes and 7 seconds. So if you have a noisy preview render, you can lower subdivisions range to 1 to 8, or 1 to 16, or 1 to 24. The maximum values are usually increased by 8. But as you can see, the noise level is pretty high. Next is noise threshold. We decrease this parameter 5-fold. So let's compare it with the default render. Not much has changed actually. This image hasn't become any clearer. The render time is practically the same, 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The takeaway here is that you should change these parameters, min subdivs, max subdivs, and noise threshold, all at once. Only then you can achieve a better result. In this test render, min subdivs is 1 and max subdivs is 24. So let's compare it with the default render. The amount of noise is almost the same. There's a difference, but it's insignificant. This render took 17 minutes to render. So compare it against the default render's 15 minutes. There's hardly any improvement. I reduced noise threshold as well as subdivs limits. I was trying to find a balance just to show you. But in this case, I had to change global illumination as well. So let's go to Global Illumination tab. And just so you know, the optimal noise threshold level is between 0.01 and 0.002. the subdivs range should be between 1 and 8 for previews. For a render which is more or less clear, it should be between 1 and 24. As for the min shading rate, its shadow quality, I recommend increasing it to about 16. So here in the GI tab, we also have environment, we have color mapping, and we have camera settings. We have them at their default values. When setting up light, you don't need to change GI environment or reflections and refractions, because we're using V-Ray Dome to illuminate the interior. The GI setting can also affect the render speed. We go to the advanced settings, and what do we have here? So first we'll turn off enable GI, and we'll do that so that global illumination doesn't render. You can do that for illustrations, you can do that for diagrams and other images where you don't need super realistic lighting. In that case, you can turn off GI and your image will render pretty fast. All right, then we have refractive and reflective GI caustics, and I recommend turning them off altogether. This is how you reduce noise if your scene has plenty of glass objects, such as glass dividers or glass tables, for example. So those glass objects will stop letting light through, especially scattered light. But if you exclude them from shadows, they'll look just fine. As a result, you'll speed up your render at a small cost, if you can say so. So then we have saturation, we have contrast, and contrast base. You can leave them as they are. They mostly affect brightness of light bounces. When, for example, we have a blue sky that sends light through windows, and its light bounces off the interior surfaces. Then you can tweak saturation and contrast. But in general, they work great with default values, so we'll just skip them. Then we have ambient occlusion, which creates darkening effect, especially on small elements. So be careful with that option. Then we enable it and set its amount to 0.3. The radius is 10 centimeters. See? It creates a slight darkening effect. So go ahead and use it for small white elements, such as moldings. It creates a delicate layer, emphasizing the details. Next come the light cache settings. And again, these parameters work well as they are. There's no need to tweak them most of the time. As you can see, the default GI settings work just fine. They don't need any adjusting. But here's another thing. V-Ray uses several light rendering algorithms. One is light cache for secondary bounces of light. The other one is brute force, and that's for primary light. It works almost the same way as in Corona. And on top of that, there's a dated method called irradiance map. It's when light is baked into. It's sort of a texture, a map. You can select it here. See? It says deprecated, meaning it's slightly dated, but that's okay. You can still use it. All right, now what settings can we tweak here? You can use one of the presets, low, medium, or high, and so on. Let's go for high. And then we enable show calculation phase to be able to see how the render is progressing. Let's start our render and see. So while the image is being rendered, you can see that there are squares, or buckets, as we call them, running all over the render. And each bucket stands for one processor in your computer. The image is split in squares, you could say. Global illumination is being baked into a map, which is then applied to the render. It's one of the methods to render global illumination. So we have threshold values here. Minimum rate is -3, and maximum rate is 0. Don't dwell too much on it. Let's switch to the custom preset. The difference between the minimum and the maximum rates indicates the number of rendering passes. First goes one rough pass, and then they become more detailed. If we change the minimum rate to -1, the number of passes will decrease by 1. And again, the difference between these two limits is the number of rendering passes. Right, next is subdivs, and that shows how much light, how much information each spot will be getting. The higher the value, the more light it will get. The light will be of higher quality, but it will render slower, obviously. So if we increase subdivs to 70, that will improve the quality of a radiance map. Now, interpolation samples shows blurriness between these spots. We'll leave it at default, and we can also take a look at the advanced settings. If you choose irradiance map as your rendering method, I recommend that you enable detail enhancement, because that ensures that V-Ray calculates fine details on moldings, on your doors, and things like that. If you have this option turned off, you risk ending up with artifacts and noise. So let's go to the History tab and take a look at my first radiance map render. Here it is. The render time is 3 minutes. It's almost noise-free. The image is very smooth and very clear, especially in shadowed areas. So with this method, image render is very fast. The only drawback is these noisy spots. To get rid of this noise, you need to raise the radiance map settings. We need to increase subdivs parameter from 50 to 70. Okay, and so next, we need to use high or very high preset. Min rate as -3 and max rate as 1. And this means V-Ray will make enough passes. Then we have detail enhancement, and here you don't need to change anything. Although you can adjust the radius of small details that will be rendered. But this is a very kind of advanced setting, and I recommend that you leave it as it is. Then there's randomized samples. You need to disable this option in order to reduce spots, because irradiance map creates these light spots chaotically. There's a strange logic behind it. But if, however, you turn off randomized samples, spots will be created along the geometry. And it makes a crucial difference in architectural visualization. When you have all kinds of objects that are perpendicular and parallel to one another, such as doors, moldings, window frames, things like that. So next we have multipass. If it's on, a radiance map will be rendered in multiple passes. If it's off, it will be calculated in one single pass. It doesn't affect render much, so we'll leave it on. All right, what else we have? So then there's check sample visibility, and I recommend turning it on. If your scene has fine elements such as moldings or door frames and things of that nature, if you leave it off, then small details, gaps and things will have artifacts and highlights. But again, it's advanced radiance map setup. You can set it up all at once and then save the final setting as a preset. Next, we have interpolation type. There's no need to change it. And finally, we have a tab called Settings. And let's see Advanced System Settings. Here we have Here we have default geometry. And you can choose between auto, you can choose between static and dynamic. And so, what's the difference here? Well, this setting has to do with RAM. If you have a low performance computer, for example, you should use dynamic mode. So suppose you have little RAM, 16 gigs, for example. Well, you can set dynamic memory limit to megabytes. And let's make it 10,000, just for instance. And this way we'll leave about 3 gigabytes of memory for your system. And the rest we'll use for rendering. During rendering, V-Ray will be using up RAM. It will be uploading geometry, light, things like that. All of that will be channeled to RAM. And once it doesn't need any of these elements, it will unload them and upload new ones. It makes the render more stable, but at the same time, it increases render time because uploading and unloading information takes time. So if you have enough RAM, I recommend that you switch to the static mode and set dynamic memory limit to 0. So in that case, you'll be using up all the RAM that you've got, and that will speed up your render big time. So if you don't have any RAM issues, go ahead and run your render in the static mode. So that seems to be it. These parameters have to do with bucket method. Buckets can move in spirals from top to bottom, and you can select between different sequences here, including triangulation, top, bottom, checker, and spiral. These settings are mostly for geeks, and they don't affect render quality. At least you won't be able to discern it. So let's see what else we have in the History tab. Here's the irradiance map render. It took 6 minutes and 28 seconds to calculate. And we've got fairly good image, although we have some spots. And if I remember correctly, I increased minimum shading rate to improve shadow quality. But irradiance map that I used was the same. Here it is. Minimum shading rate. It's currently at 16. But even though the noise level has dropped, the spots are still there. And that's because the irradiance map is the same. Here, in the last test render, I increased the quality of irradiance map quite a bit, and you can clearly see the effect on the door frames here. So this is what it looked like when I used the default irradiance map, and this is the high preset. All right. So that was it on render settings in V-Ray. Let's do some summing up. So we'll compare the default render and the irradiance map render. The render with default settings took 15 minutes and 9 seconds to calculate. The render with a high quality irradiance map took 22 minutes to calculate. So that's a noticeable difference, but irradiance map has managed to significantly reduce the noise. Now look here. Look at these table legs. This is how they look in the default render. And this is what irradiance map has done. No noise. The difference in render time is about 5 minutes. It's around 30% of the overall time. So there's one final piece of advice I have for you. I recommend that you set up all these parameters one by one. Setting up all parameters in one go and then staring at the render is not a good idea, because you won't know how each parameter affected your image and which setting needs further adjustment. So pay most attention to these progressive image sample settings. You can change max subdivs from 100 to 24, for example. Noise threshold, the default value is 0.01. You can lower it as well. By lowering this setting, you can increase render time while getting rid of noise. As for min shading rate, you should increase that. And finally, as for image filter, well, that smooths out the noise. And I don't usually use this filter, so I'll keep it off, all right? Some visualizers like it, I don't. Okay? Well, that was it on render settings in V-Ray. Only change progressive image sampler settings, and as for the rest, leave them at default. Radiance is optional. I tweaked it just to show you the effect. So those are advanced settings for those of you who want a deeper dive into the topic. All right, thanks for watching. Good luck and have fun.